This was a few months ago. I'd been working the overnight front desk at a small roadside motel in northern Ontario for about 8 months at that point. One of those highway motels that exist for a single functional purpose, which is to give long-haul truckers and cross-province travelers somewhere to stop and sleep before they get back on the road. Nothing about it was glamorous. 40-some rooms on 2 floors, a lobby with a vending machine and a coffee maker that ran around the clock, a parking lot built to handle 18-wheelers, and a view of the highway in both directions. That was it. That was the whole place. The overnight shift ran 11 to 7. For the first hour or two, there were usually a handful of late check-ins, a trucker coming off a long haul, an exhausted family that had pushed their drive too far. After about 1 in the morning, it went dead. Completely dead. You did your rounds, checked the exterior doors, restocked the lobby coffee, updated the maintenance log, and found ways to stay awake until dawn. Most nights I'd go 4 or 5 hours without seeing or hearing a single person. You learn to stop expecting things to happen. That night, a winter storm had been building since late afternoon. By the time I arrived for my shift at 11, the snow was already heavy, and the highway traffic had thinned to almost nothing. The provincial police had issued an advisory recommending people stay off the roads unless travel was essential. We had 11 guests checked in, 3 long-haul truckers, 2 families, and a few solo travelers who'd decided to wait out the storm. No more check-ins were expected. The parking lot was quiet, the highway was quiet, and everything pointed to one of the slowest nights in months. I settled in at the desk, made a fresh pot of coffee, and started working through the logbook updates. It was routine, quiet in the way that motel nights always are, but not unusual. Just the sound of the heating system cycling, the occasional creak of the building in the wind. At around 1 in the morning, the desk phone rang. We almost never get calls. The front desk number is technically listed, but in 8 months of working that shift, I could count on one hand the number of times the phone had rung after midnight, and every one of those was a guest with a problem. I checked the display before picking up. It showed an internal extension, room 114. I answered and asked how I could help. Silence. Not the silence of a dead line. The call was clearly connected, the line open, the faint ambient sound of a room audible on the other end. Someone had picked up the phone and dialed the front desk, but no one spoke. I waited a few seconds and tried again. Nothing. I hung up and pulled up the reservation system. Room 114 had no active booking. It had been vacant since the previous Sunday, cleaned and marked as ready. Nobody had been assigned to it all week. I sat with that for a moment. The phones in the rooms are analog. There is no mechanism by which a phone in an empty room dials the front desk on its own. Someone had to be in that room, holding the handset, choosing not to speak. I noted it in the log as a probable equipment fault, partly because I wanted there to be a mundane explanation, and partly because I knew I had to go check regardless. I grabbed the master key and walked down the first floor corridor. The hallway was cold. Colder than it should have been. The heating on that wing had been finicky for weeks, but that night it was particularly noticeable, the kind of chill that seeps into the air and makes the fluorescent lights overhead feel even more clinical than usual. My footsteps were very loud in the quiet. I got to room 114 and knocked twice. Nothing. I used the master key and pushed the door open. Empty. Bed made tight, blinds closed, everything in its place. I crossed to the nightstand and looked at the phone. The handset was off the cradle, not fallen off, not knocked sideways, but lifted and set deliberately to one side, the way you'd put it down after finishing a call. I replaced it, checked the bathroom, confirmed nobody was there, and walked back to the desk. I'd been back at the front desk for maybe 40 minutes when the motion sensor alert came up on my monitor. We had security cameras covering the main corridors. Old system, low resolution, but functional. The indicator for the first floor hallway was lit. I switched to that feed and looked. The hallway was empty, but the motion indicator was still active, which meant the sensor was still reading something. I stared at the image. The corridor looked exactly as it always did at that hour. Empty, cold, flickering slightly under the fluorescent lights. And then I saw it. On the floor of the hallway, visible from the camera angle, there was a thin strip of light coming from under the door of room 114. And within that strip of light, there was a shadow. Stationary, centered in the door gap. Someone was standing directly on the other side of that door, in a room that had no working interior lights on, with some source of light behind them, standing completely still. I called our overnight security guard and asked him to come in from the parking lot. While I waited, I kept watching the feed. The shadow did not move once in the 5 minutes it took him to get inside and reach the desk. We walked down together. As we approached room 114, I noticed the door wasn't fully latched. A thin gap between the door and the frame, just a few millimeters, but visible. I had closed that door completely when I left. I was certain of it. He pushed the door open with his shoulder and put his flashlight into the room. Empty, but different from before. The entry mat just inside the door had wet patches on it. Snow melt from boots, recent enough that the water was still dark and hadn't begun to dry. And the window across the room, which I had seen fully closed and latched during my first visit, was now open. Not all the way, about 10 inches, just enough for a person to have climbed through. He leaned out of the window with his flashlight and went quiet for a moment. Then he called me over. On the exterior ledge, dusted with a thin layer of fresh snow, there were handprints. Wide, clear, pressed firmly into the snow from the outside. Someone had gripped that ledge from below and hauled themselves up and through. The room was on the ground floor, but that side of the building faced the back of the property, a narrow service lane between the motel's exterior wall and the tree line. No lights back there, no cameras covering that angle. In a snowstorm at 2 in the morning, it would have been completely invisible from the road. The provincial police came out. They were thorough, swept every floor, knocked on every occupied room, confirmed all the 11 registered guests were present and accounted for. No unauthorized persons found anywhere on the property. What they did find was a window in the utility corridor at the far end of the back wing that had been forced from the outside. That was presumably the entry point. From there, someone had moved through the back of the building, reached room 114, entered through the window from the exterior ledge, placed a call to the front desk, and left the same way they'd come in, all without being seen in the middle of a blizzard at 2 in the morning. The officers had no explanation for the motive. Nothing had been taken from the room. The cash drawer at the front desk was untouched. There was no evidence of any attempt to access other rooms. Whatever that person had come into that motel to do, a phone call to the front desk in silence appears to have been part of it. I submitted my resignation the following morning. When I came back a few days later to collect my things, I passed my manager in the lobby. We shook hands, exchanged the usual pleasantries. And as I was heading toward the exit, he said something that stopped me, quietly, almost to himself, like he was just noting a fact about the weather. "You're not the first one to leave after a night like that." I turned around. He was already walking away, back toward the office, like he hadn't said anything worth following up on. I've thought about those 7 words more times than I can count. Not the first, which means there have been others. Which means whatever happened that night, or something enough like it, had happened before. And my manager knew. And he hadn't mentioned it. Not in the 8 months I'd worked there, not in any conversation we'd ever had, not even in the aftermath of that night. I never called to ask him what he meant. I still think about it. It was January, about 2 years ago. I live in a single-family house at the dead end of a quiet residential street, one of those streets where you only end up if you're going somewhere specific. There's nowhere to pass through to, just 5 houses, a cul-de-sac, and a lot of trees. I'm in northern Minnesota, deep inland, and winters up here are something else entirely. People who've never spent a January this far north have a hard time understanding what it actually means. It's not just cold. It's the kind of cold that changes how you move through the world. You plan around it, you check the forecast before you make any decision. You know which roads flood with ice first, which neighbors have generators, and you always keep your gas tank above half. Because if your car breaks down out here in January, you have maybe 20 minutes before it becomes a real emergency. That year, we got hit with a brutal cold snap right in the middle of the month. The National Weather Service had issued a wind chill advisory for the entire region. Actual temps around -15, with gusts pushing the wind chill to -40. Schools called closures the night before. Most businesses opened late or not at all. I'd gotten home early from work, cranked the baseboard heaters up as far as they go, and made the decision around 4 in the afternoon that I was not leaving that house again until the advisory lifted. I ordered food from a place that was still delivering, tipped the driver more than the meal cost because, honestly, and settled in on the couch. I had nowhere to be. The wind outside was loud enough that you could hear it, even with the TV on. This low, constant howl that's specific to winter nights out here. After a while, it almost becomes background noise. Almost. My dog's name is Buck. He's a black lab, about 4 years old at the time, big and calm and not prone to drama. In 4 years, I'd never once seen him spook at nothing. He's the kind of dog that sleeps through thunderstorms and doesn't even flinch when the snowplow goes by at 2 in the morning. So when he started making that low whining sound from the front room sometime around midnight, I paid attention. It wasn't a bark, it was something more uncertain than that. A low, unsettled sound, the kind dogs make when something is bothering them and they can't identify what. I got up from the couch and found him standing at the side window, the one that looks out onto the narrow gap between my house and the abandoned foreclosure next door. That house has been sitting empty for going on 5 years now. The bank owns it. Nobody lives there, nobody visits. The lawn goes unmowed all summer and the driveway goes unshoveled all winter. It's just there. I looked out the window. Nothing. Snow piled up on the sill, the dark gap between the two houses, the pale gray siding of the empty place catching a little light from the street. No movement, no animal, nothing I could point to. I scratched Buck behind the ears, told him he was fine, and brought him back to the couch with me. Figured maybe a possum had gotten up under the porch next door. It happens. 20 minutes passed. I was halfway through something on TV. Buck was settled at my feet, and everything felt normal again. Then the doorbell rang. I want to take a second here to explain exactly why that sound hit me the way it did, because on the surface, a doorbell ringing isn't a scary thing. But it was midnight. It was -15 outside with -40 wind chill. I live on a dead-end street with 5 houses on it. There is no reason, none, to be standing at my front door at that hour in those conditions unless you came here with specific intention. You don't wander down my street. You don't cut through it. You make a decision to come here, and then you come here. I got up slowly and went to the door, looked through the peephole. There was a woman standing on my porch. She looked to be in her mid-30s. She was wearing a dark coat that wasn't particularly heavy for the weather, and her hair was wet. Not just damp, but actually wet and partially covered with snow, the way it gets when you've been outside long enough for snow to accumulate on you, which meant she'd walked some distance to get here, in -15, at midnight. But the thing that made my stomach drop wasn't any of that. It was her posture. She wasn't doing any of the things a person does when they're cold and scared and standing on a stranger's porch asking for help. She wasn't stamping her feet, wasn't pulling her coat tighter, wasn't looking around nervously or shifting her weight. She was completely, perfectly still, and she was looking directly at the peephole. Not at the door in general, at the peephole specifically, like she knew exactly where it was and exactly where my eye would be. I stood there for a moment without saying anything. She didn't knock again, didn't call out, just waited with that same unnerving stillness. I asked who she was. She said she was Carol, my neighbor, the retired woman who lives 3 houses up on the same side of the street. Said her furnace had gone out and the house was getting dangerously cold and she needed help. Now Carol is real. She's in her late 60s, lives alone since her husband passed, and we have a friendly enough relationship. Wave when we see each other, exchanged numbers a couple years ago in case of emergencies. So there was a layer of logic to what the woman was saying. Furnace failure in a cold snap like this is genuinely dangerous for an older person living alone. It made a certain kind of sense, except that voice was not Carol's. I've heard Carol's voice hundreds of times. She has a particular way of talking, a little gravelly, unhurried, with that flat upper Midwest cadence you get from spending a whole life this far north. The woman at my door didn't sound like that. She sounded younger, and Carol is a small woman, barely 5 feet. The woman standing on my porch was noticeably taller. I told her as evenly as I could manage that I was going to call Carol first to confirm everything was okay, just to make sure. She said nothing. She just stood there, looking. I stepped away from the door and called Carol. It rang 4 times, and she picked up with the groggy, confused voice of someone pulled out of deep sleep. I asked if she was all right. She said yes. I asked if she'd sent anyone to my house. She paused, then said no. She was in bed. She hadn't sent anyone anywhere. Why was I asking? I told her not to worry. I'd explain tomorrow, and hung up. I went back to the peephole. She was gone. Not stepping off the porch as I watched, just gone. No movement, no retreating footsteps crunching on the packed snow, no sound at all. I stood there with my eye at the peephole for a full minute. Nothing. The porch was empty. Then Buck, who had followed me to the door, moved away. I turned and watched him walk to the back window of the house, and when I saw his posture, low, rigid, the fur along his spine raised, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. I went to the back window and looked out into the yard. Everything white and still. But at the far edge of the yard, right along the property line where my lot meets the abandoned house's lot, there was a shadow. A long shadow cast by the streetlight from the next block over, falling across the snow. And the shadow had the unmistakable shape of a person standing upright. It didn't move. I watched it for what felt like a very long time. The wind moved the branches above. The shadows from the trees shifted slightly, but that one shadow stayed perfectly still. Then it was gone. Not gradually, just gone, like whoever was casting it had stepped back behind the fence line or into the abandoned house. I called 911. I want to say I felt a little silly doing it, but honestly, I didn't. I told them what happened as clearly as I could. 2 deputies came out within about 20 minutes, swept around the perimeter of the property, checked the backyard, and then entered the foreclosed house next door with a key from a lockbox the bank had installed. They didn't find anyone inside, but one of the deputies came back to my door with a look on his face that I hadn't seen when he went in. He told me there were signs of recent habitation in one of the upstairs bedrooms, disturbances in the dust on the floor, an old sleeping bag folded up in the corner, and the window, the one on the side of the house facing the gap between our properties. The exact window Buck had been staring at before any of this started had its interior latch undone, not broken, undone from the inside, deliberately. The deputy's working theory was a transient using the empty house for shelter. Possible. But that doesn't explain why she came to my door. Doesn't explain why she impersonated my neighbor by name. Doesn't explain what she wanted badly enough to walk to a dead-end street at midnight in -40 wind chill to get it. And it doesn't explain why, after I wouldn't open the door, she went and stood in my backyard in silence. I had a security system installed that week. I've since introduced myself to all 5 of my neighbors and made sure we have each other's numbers. And I've never once answered the door after dark without first walking to every window on the ground floor and checking what's outside. Buck still pauses sometimes at that side window, just stands there for a second, looking at the gap between the houses. Then he moves on. I don't know what he sees. I'm not sure I want to. This was the winter of 2022. I was living in Chicago and had been for about 3 years at that point. No car, no need for one. The train was everything. I lived near a station on the northwest side, in one of those neighborhoods that feels fine in the daytime and shifts into something harder to read after midnight. Not dangerous exactly, just different. The station itself was underground, one exit, and past a certain hour it got very quiet. The kind of quiet where you hear your own footsteps echoing and start paying attention to things you normally tune out. I was doing freelance work at the time for a client whose office was in the loop. The meetings had a habit of running late. Something about the way that team operated meant nothing wrapped up when it was supposed to. It wasn't unusual for me to be catching a train home after 11, sometimes closer to midnight. I'd made that ride enough times to know exactly what it looked and felt like at that hour. Mostly empty cars, mostly silence. The train moving fast through the underground sections and slower on the elevated stretches where the snow and ice built up on the tracks. I was comfortable with it. It was just the commute. That night the meeting had gone until nearly midnight. I came up out of the downtown station into a full Chicago winter, which is a specific thing. The cold there isn't just cold, it has weight to it and direction. The wind comes off the lake and hits you at an angle and finds every gap in your clothing simultaneously. The snow was heavy and coming sideways. The streets downtown, which are usually still reasonably populated even late on a weeknight, were almost empty. People had decided to stay in. I made my transfer and got on the train heading northwest, found a seat, and settled in. The car thinned out as we got further from downtown. By the time we were a few stops from mine, there were maybe 5 or 6 of us in the car. A woman with her phone out a few seats ahead, a couple of guys in work jackets near the far doors, a few others. Quiet. Normal for that hour. The stop before mine, the doors opened and one person got on. I noticed him before he'd fully stepped through the door. There was nothing about him that announced itself loudly. It was more like the eye registering an inconsistency. He was dressed completely wrong for the weather. Thin jacket, the kind you'd wear in October, not January. Jeans, canvas shoes with no visible socks. No hat, no gloves, no scarf. His jacket shoulders and hair had snow on them, the accumulated kind, which meant he'd been outside for an extended period. But he was moving normally. Not hunched, not hurrying, not doing the involuntary physical things that bodies do when they've been standing in below freezing temperatures. He walked into the car with this unhurried, even calm that felt mismatched with everything his appearance was telling me. The car had plenty of open seats. He walked past several of them and sat down directly across from me. This is the kind of thing that sounds small when you describe it, but if you've spent time on late-night public transit, you understand why it registers. There's an unspoken etiquette to empty train cars. You take the seat that gives everyone space. You don't sit across from a stranger when there are rows of empty seats available. It's not a rule anyone states. It's just what people do. He walked past at least 8 empty seats and chose the one directly facing mine. I looked up when he sat. He was already looking at me. Not a glance, not a reflexive moment of eye contact before looking away. He was looking directly at me with the settled attention of someone who had been watching and intended to keep watching. His eyes were very light, almost colorless in the fluorescent lighting of the car, and they didn't move when mine met them. There was no flicker of social awareness, no slight adjustment the way people make when eye contact goes a second too long. He just held it. I looked down at my phone and kept it in my hands as something to focus on, but I could feel it continuing. That specific physical sensation of being watched. I told myself I was tired, told myself I was reading into nothing, and did not look up again until the train was slowing into my station. I looked up once, at the stop before mine, to check the map out of habit. He was still looking at me. The doors opened at my station and I got off. The platform was empty. No one else exiting, no one waiting to board, no transit workers visible anywhere on the platform. The fluorescent lights hummed. My footsteps were very loud. I walked toward the exit corridor and the stairs up to street level. Behind me I heard the doors close, and then I heard footsteps on the platform, one set, coming in my direction. I stopped and turned around. He had gotten off the train. We were the only 2 people on the platform. He was maybe 30 feet back, and when I turned, when our eyes met in that empty underground space, he smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, more in the eyes than the mouth. But it was unmistakably deliberate, not the reflexive smile of someone caught in an awkward social moment. Something quieter and more considered than that. Something that had no warmth in it at all. I turned and walked fast toward the exit corridor. It's a single passage, tiled walls on both sides, turnstiles at the end, maybe 40 feet total. My footsteps off the tile were loud and fast, and underneath them I could hear his, and they were moving faster than I expected. Not running, but closing the gap. I went through the turnstile and took the stairs at a near run, came out onto the street. Wind and snow hit me immediately, hard enough that I had to lean into it. The block was completely empty. No cabs idling at the corner, no one walking, no cars moving. My apartment was 6 blocks north, a walk I'd made hundreds of times. At 12:30 in a blizzard with the sound of those footsteps still in my head, 6 blocks felt like a problem. I turned north and walked as fast as the snow-covered sidewalk would let me. I was picking my footing carefully, because a fall out here alone at this hour was its own kind of risk. Half a block in, I heard the station exit behind me, the sound of someone coming up the stairs to street level. I turned at the next corner instead of going straight. There was a 24-hour convenience store on a busier street about 2 blocks east. I'd gone there 100 times for late-night coffee on the way home from the train. I headed for it. A block and a half later, I looked back. He had turned the same corner. He was maybe 40 feet back, moving at a steady pace through the snow, not hurrying, not hanging back, just walking and looking. I walked into the convenience store and moved immediately to the back near the register area. Grabbed something off a shelf without looking at it. The guy working the overnight shift was in his 20s and had the particular alertness of someone used to reading the room at that hour. He looked at me, took in whatever was on my face, and didn't say anything. Just nodded slightly. I stood there and focused on slowing my breathing. I stayed in that store for close to 15 minutes. I watched the front windows the entire time. For the first several minutes, I expected to see him appear on the sidewalk outside, or worse, push through the door. Neither happened. The sidewalk in front of the store was empty when I finally let myself look directly at it, and it stayed empty. I took the long way home. Main streets, well lit, the route that added 10 minutes, but stayed near open businesses the whole way. I didn't see him again. For the next few days, I replayed it the way you do, trying to find the version of events where it was nothing. Maybe he just happened to exit at my stop. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he was just one of those people who stares without registering it. I almost had myself convinced by the 3rd day. Then my upstairs neighbor knocked on my door. She worked nights at a hospital on the north side and took the same train line home. We'd waved to each other in the hallway for a year and had maybe 3 real conversations, but she knocked on my door and asked, without much preamble, whether I'd noticed anything strange at the station recently. Before I said anything, she described him. Light jacket in the cold, pale eyes that didn't look away. She'd been on the train 2 nights after my incident. He'd gotten on at the same stop she had. He'd gotten off at her stop. He'd walked in the same direction she walked home, all the way to the point where she made a fast decision to turn into a Walgreens. She'd stood in the pharmacy aisle and called her partner and asked him to come get her. She'd watched through the store window. The man had stopped on the sidewalk outside in the snow and stood there looking in through the window until her partner's car pulled up. Different night, same man. The same stop, the same direction, the same controlled and patient following. We went to the police together. The officer who took the report was professional and honest. Without a defined criminal act, without a clear identity, without footage clear enough to work with, the options were limited. They'd look at the station cameras. That was more or less the extent of it. Neither of us saw him again after that. I switched train lines, a longer route, an extra transfer, but it avoided that station completely. I still use the train every day. I still ride alone late at night sometimes. But I notice things differently now. I notice where people choose to sit when there are empty options. I notice who gets off at my stop. I notice who comes up the stairs behind me. And every once in a while, on the long underground stretches where the car is quiet and there are only a few of us left riding, I think about what it means to be that alone. Not the everyday aloneness of a late-night commute. The other kind. The kind where you're underground, in the dark, in a city that's gone to sleep, and the person across from you is smiling, and you don't know why. This was in the winter of 2018. I've been a distance runner since college, and when I relocated to interior Alaska for work, one of the first things I did was scout the local trail system. I wasn't disappointed. Even in deep winter, especially in deep winter, the trails up there are extraordinary. Groomed, marked, winding through spruce forest and along frozen waterways, and at night, almost completely deserted. That last part was important to me. I'd spent years running in places where you had to share the path with cyclists and dog walkers and people who didn't understand trail etiquette. And there was something genuinely freeing about having miles of maintained trail entirely to myself. My standard route was a 5-mile loop through a large public park on the edge of town. It connected to a wider network of trails that stretched further into the woods, but I stuck to the main loop, well-marked, decently lit at intervals, and familiar enough that I could run it in the dark without thinking too hard about navigation. I'd been doing it 2 or 3 times a week for about 2 years. In that time, I'd seen maybe a handful of other people out there after 9 at night, and never anything that gave me pause. That specific evening, I headed out around 10:15. The temperature was sitting around 5 degrees Fahrenheit, but the wind was low and the sky had partially cleared, which made it feel more manageable than it sounds. One of those winter nights that's actually beautiful once you accept the cold and stop fighting it. The snowpack on the trail was firm and even. My footing was good. And for the first 10 minutes or so, it was exactly the kind of run I'd come up there for. Quiet in the specific way that only happens when everything around you is frozen and the sound just stops carrying the way it normally does. I was about 15 minutes in when I noticed the tracks coming toward me. Footprints in the snow, heading in the opposite direction. Someone had come from further up the trail and walked or jogged back toward the trailhead. Nothing unusual about that. People use the trails at night. I registered it and kept moving. Then the tracks stopped. Right in the middle of the trail, without any explanation, the footprints simply ended. I slowed to a walk and looked around. To my right, the ground sloped down toward a frozen creek about 20 feet below the trail level, and the snow on that embankment was smooth and undisturbed. Nobody had gone that way. To my left, the spruce trees started immediately at the trail edge, packed close together, their branches still heavy with snow. I swept my headlamp through them. The snow between the trunks was untouched, and there were no return tracks, no second set of prints heading back the way the person had come from. The tracks just ended. Someone had walked to that exact point, and then, as far as the physical evidence was concerned, stopped existing. I stood there longer than I should have, headlamp moving back and forth between the tree line and the embankment, trying to find the explanation I was missing. The rational part of my brain generated a list. Maybe the wind had redistributed the snow and covered the continuation of the tracks, but the rest of the trail surface was clean and consistent. There'd been no wind event significant enough to selectively erase footprints in one spot. Maybe I was misreading the direction, and the tracks were actually going the same way I was, not toward me. I checked again. No, they came from ahead and stopped here. After maybe a minute, I made myself move. I told myself I was tired, that my headlamp was playing tricks, that there was some simple explanation I'd see clearly in the morning. I picked up my pace and finished the loop without incident. The rest of the trail was exactly as it always was. Dark, quiet, cold. The kind of run that clears your head completely. I turned around at the far end and started the return. When I reached the spot again, I stopped without deciding to. The original tracks were still there. But now, beginning from that exact point where they'd ended, that precise spot in the snow where the footprints had simply stopped, there was a new set of prints. They ran parallel to my tracks, the ones I'd left going out. And they went in the same direction I had gone, continuing forward along the trail, matching my route stride for stride. Someone had been standing at that spot. Still, in the dark, off to the side of the trail or somehow concealed, I don't know how, I don't know where, while I ran past them. And once I was far enough ahead, they had followed me. The cold feeling I got in that moment was different from the cold of the air around me. It started in my chest and moved outward, and for a second I just stood there, completely still, headlamp pointed at those parallel tracks in the snow. Then I started running. Not full speed. The trail surface wouldn't allow it without risking a fall, and I knew that a twisted ankle out here at night would be a serious problem. But I ran as hard as I safely could, and I kept my headlamp angled behind me every 30 seconds. The trail was empty every time I looked. Whatever was back there, I couldn't see it. But the parallel tracks stayed consistent every time I looked down, running right alongside my outgoing footprints, all the way up the trail. They stopped about 100 yards before the trailhead, right around the point where the parking lot lights became visible through the trees. The tracks just ended again, the same way the first set had. No branching off, no clear sign of where they went. Whoever had been following me had stopped before reaching the open lit area. That detail, the deliberateness of it, the awareness of where the light started, is the thing that has stayed with me the most. I got to my truck, got in, hit the locks, and sat with the engine running. My headlamp was still on, and I watched the trailhead entrance through the windshield. After about 2 minutes, I saw a shape at the edge of the light, standing at the exact point where the illuminated parking area dissolved into dark trail, completely motionless, just there, at the boundary, facing in my direction. I put the truck in gear and drove away. I didn't stop at the edge of the lot to look longer. I didn't drive slowly. I left. In the months that followed, I went back to that trail many times during daylight hours and never experienced anything strange. The trail was exactly what it had always been, a well-maintained public path through beautiful country. But after dark, I never went back. That version of the trail, the night version, the one I'd loved for 2 years, was just gone for me after that. The thing that closed the door completely was a conversation I had with a coworker a few months later. She was also a runner, also used that park. I didn't tell her what had happened. I just mentioned offhand that I'd had a weird experience on the trail at night. She got quiet in a way that told me she knew exactly what kind of weird I meant. She said she hadn't gone back after dark either. Said she'd heard something on that same trail one night, breathing close, somewhere just off the path in the spruce. When she turned her headlamp toward it, a branch snapped in the dark. She'd run the whole way back to her car without stopping. She didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't ask for one. We both understood there wasn't one that would actually help.